Is America's infrastructure crumbling? Driving down the street every day, hitting potholes and getting stuck in traffic? Well, it's easy to believe. However, that may not be the whole truth. So we're going to take a look at America's infrastructure and hopefully determine if it is indeed crumbling or flourishing. There is a great debate going on in America. It is one that many Americans, in fact, have no idea exists. You see, many take for granted that what they hear from both sides of the aisle is true, that the infrastructure of the United States is crumbling.
We have a national crisis in terms of infrastructure.
We think our roads and our bridges are falling apart when what's underneath is even more troubling.
1/3 of all urban pavements now are considered in poor condition in that they're giving motorists a rough ride.
But not everyone is convinced.
The vast majority of our infrastructure that performs as it's supposed to is out of sight, out of mind, out of the news. People aren't paying any attention to it.
When you look at government data, the data do not at all show that our infrastructures are crumbling.
People often say the highways are crumbling, but if you look at the data, actually, American highways, especially the interstates, have got better and better over the years.
In this edition of Taking Care of Business, we'll try to discover the truth about America's infrastructure.
Taking care of business. Taking care of business.
We're taking a look at a debate that's going on in nearly every neighborhood in America. Hello, I'm Kelly Wright, and we're taking care of business. Down to the pavement on your street and in the ground below it, or even in the air above it, are the things that provide us with our very way of life. From the electrical grid to the water distribution system we depend on, the basic necessities that run the engine of our lives are a resource vital to every American. The demand on these systems continue to grow. Our infrastructure needs ongoing maintenance, upgrades, or replacement in order to meet the demands. How and when to best accomplish that is the question. The level of concern is debated in the halls of government, behind the wheel of our cars, and in the offices of politicians, and everywhere else, educators and professionals. So let's begin at the offices of the ASCE in Washington, D.C.
The American Society of Civil Engineers releases a report card on the state of our nation's infrastructure every 4 years. Just like it is when you come home from school. A C is fair, you're doing your job, you're okay if you get a C. A D is poor, F is failing to meet our needs. We've been doing this since 1998, and the most recent report card was released last spring in 2017.
The ASCE report graded bridges a C+, roads a D, aviation a D, and transit a D-. It also showed that Americans spent 6.9 billion hours delayed in traffic. More than 9% of the nation's bridges are structurally deficient, meaning they require repair and more frequent inspection. Congestion at airports continues to grow. By 2020, 4 out of the 5 major airports will experience Thanksgiving holiday traffic at least once a week. The report also shows that transit ridership is at its highest level in 4 decades. But transit systems across the country have billions of dollars in surplus. This resulted in the report card's lowest grade. Collectively, the ASCE research found that transportation infrastructure has more than $1 trillion in unmet funding needs. Surface transportation needs $1.1 trillion invested, and aviation needs about $42 billion.
Unfortunately, the grades are nothing that you would write home about or be proud to take home to your parents.
Energy didn't score much better with a grade of D+. The demand for electrical power is at an all-time high. Right now, about 124 million U.S. households are using electricity supplied by the power grid, a grid that the ASCE says is already running at full capacity.
There are almost 3,600 outages a year in our infrastructure. That averages out to roughly 10 a day.
Most electric transmission and distribution lines were constructed in the 1950s and 1960s with a 50-year life expectancy. Without proper attention to aging equipment, as well as addressing storm and climate impacts, experts believe Americans will likely experience longer and more frequent power interruptions.
Think about what that means. There's power grid outages, there's water main breaks that we see that not just impact that direct community that now is under a boil water advisory, but it possibly impacts the entire community around the area that now has extra transportation congestion and diversions because that water main break was so significant that they had to reroute traffic.
What we've seen in the last 5 years is a significant increase in vehicle travel. It's a positive sign because it reflects economic growth. We saw after the recession of 2008 about a 5-year period where we didn't see much vehicle travel growth. Now we're seeing travel increasing about 1.5% a year. That's higher than most people had anticipated, and while it's certainly good news in terms of the economy, it also means more wear and tear on our transportation system and more traffic congestion.
There are more than 263 million registered vehicles traveling on U.S. roads. As a nation, that's second only to China. This creates more than traffic problems. It deteriorates the roadways.
1/3 of all urban pavements now are considered in poor condition in that they're giving motorists a rough ride, and we have found that the cost of driving on rough roads nationally now is $130 billion annually, where the average motorist, it costs them an additional $599 per year.
Some residents understand the cost of bad roads firsthand.
I've been on the street since 1975, and we have not had this street paved, and I have been trying to get it paved since like about 2005, maybe a little earlier. I got a file of paperwork here that I've sent to the city. They wrote me back, and I just got a letter maybe about a month and a half ago saying that they were gonna be looking at repaving the street. I was told a couple years ago it was gonna be repaved. Nobody did anything. So what they did, they came out and they dropped some tar down there at the end in the entrance into the street, and they dropped some back the other way. And I said, oh, that's the paving?
There are many people in Mary's position in her native city of Detroit. What was one of the greatest centers of industry and advancement in the country is now broken down. Detroit's roads, for example, are ranked 4th worst in the nation for cities with 500,000 people or more, costing the city's inhabitants an extra $866 in vehicle repairs per year.
Last week I had my car into the dealership because I hit a pothole, and luckily I had the insurance for it, and I just had it repaired. I'd just like to see the city, do a little bit more for the neighborhood.
Unfortunately, the city doesn't seem eager to lend a hand.
This is what I sent in March. This is a paper that I sent out, and I told them I had all my dates on here, when I had been sending stuff, letters that I received go back to 2010, and then I had got this letter, like I said, back, take a look here and see what the date is. I had to put my glasses on for this here. This was May 11th. Have processed your complaint and forward your concern to appropriate department. For your information, a copy of the complaint is enclosed. It can take up to 30 days to get a response. We suggest that you hold on to the complaint number issued by the office so that we can follow up if necessary. This was May 11th, after I had sent them, another letter. So it still hasn't been done. Like I said, what they did, they put that little tar down there and a little down there. If I said, well, dang, if you were gonna do the street like that, just do the whole middle, but they didn't.
Economists agree that maintenance of roads and infrastructures is probably where you would get the biggest bang for the buck. but there's no ribbon cutting ceremony when you fill potholes. So politicians tend to not prefer these projects, and instead they'd rather like the big white elephant project, the thing that will lead to the front page of the local newspapers.
And just down the road from Detroit, one city's lack of infrastructure maintenance led to headlines of a far more sinister variety. In 2014, the city of Flint was in economic trouble, suffering from many of the same hardships as Detroit, brought on by the collapse of the auto industry in the area. City officials were looking for a cheaper way to bring necessities to the city. Prior to 2014, Flint had received its water from Detroit pipelines. But to save money, the city's managers took Flint off the Detroit pipeline water and started funneling water from the Flint River through their own treatment center and straight into the taps of residents. Immediately after Flint made the switch to river water, things started going terribly wrong, and people started getting sick.
The situation in Flint was a perfect storm because of many factors. Our water source was changed from the Great Lakes to the Flint River without proper treatment.
The crisis of 2015 was brought to the national spotlight by Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha. Her research revealed that children were exposed to dangerous levels of lead in the public water.
That corrosive water went through an aging distribution system. Our distribution system has a lot of lead in our pipes and our plumbing. So it was a combination of the lack of water treatment and then that water flowing through that aging distribution system that had lead that created this problem. We actually don't see lead in water. It's invisible, it's odorless, it's tasteless. We also don't see the impact of lead. It's known as a silent pediatric epidemic. We don't see its consequences in our exam rooms and clinic. It's something that comes out years, if not decades later.
It took until October 15, 2015, nearly 18 months after the problems began. That's when Governor Rick Snyder approved a switch back to Detroit water. Unfortunately, during the incident that came to be known as the Flint water crisis, hundreds of people got sick. The massive corrosion negated the effects of the chlorine treatment that cleaned the water. Without it, E. coli bacteria was free to multiply and infect many people. The iron in the water also fed the bacteria that causes Legionnaire's disease. There was also a 58% increase in fetal deaths that occurred at the time of the crisis. A still unknown number of adults and children were exposed to lead poisoning. After the dust settled in the city of Flint, the question on everyone's lips was how? How did this situation spiral so drastically out of control?
I think that they had made decisions that allowed their system to slip into further and further disrepair. Once it was brought to the national attention, federal money started coming in, state money was appropriated for it, and there was a local focus on it. So that's an example where all three levels of government work together to try to fix a problem.
Yeah, our infrastructure needs massive investment. We think our roads and our bridges are falling apart, but what's underneath is even more troubling. And Flint is a glaring example of what can happen when we fail to invest in infrastructure.
But not everyone blames a lack of funding for the Flint disaster. Some believe an independent council of experts should have been brought in during the design phase of the project.
I'm as confident as I could be that one of those people would have identified exactly what occurred, and it could have been prevented fairly inexpensively. So it was a human problem. It was not an infrastructure problem per se.
I think one of the problems with that was that all three levels of government were involved in the Flint water system, either building and operating it or maintaining or supposedly looking out for the safety. I think that caused irresponsibility, that when you get, if all three levels of government are involved, then really no one is responsible.
Regardless of who's to blame, Flint and Michigan are seen as microcosms of a much bigger infrastructure problem here in the U.S.
Lead in plumbing is not a Flint problem, it's a national problem. We use lead in plumbing throughout this nation, especially in the Northeast and the Midwest. We mandated it in some communities that they had to use lead in their plumbing.
We have a national crisis in terms of infrastructure. All levels of government have to make infrastructure a priority.
But not every infrastructure expert thinks the problem is quite so catastrophic.
When you look at government data, the data do not at all show that our infrastructure are crumbling. So for instance, it shows that 7.5% of urban interstates are in poor condition. Only 2% of rural interstates are in poor condition. When it comes to bridges, 7.5% of bridges have structural problems, and it's a little over 18% who have function problems. They're either too narrow or too low.
American highways, especially the interstates, have got better and better over the years. The government actually measures how many potholes and how smooth the surface of the interstates is, and they've got better over the last few decades. The roads have got more congested, but the actual quality has improved. Similar with U.S. bridges. There's about 600,000 highway bridges in the United States. They've been getting better and better over the years. However, some infrastructure is starting to fall apart. Subway and light rail systems across the country are having real problems. Subway systems in New York and Washington, D.C., for example, there's a huge amount of deferred maintenance, in other words, maintenance that they haven't done. And so the systems are starting to break down more.
Our infrastructure today is vaster and more complex than it's ever been. Millions of miles of roads and sewers and water main and thousands of water treatment plants and wastewater plants, and most of it is performing the way it's supposed to perform. So a small percentage of that is always going to be failing, and an even smaller percentage is going to be in crisis. We know that our roads and intersections are safer. Notwithstanding incidents like Flint, we know that almost all of our water is safer and more reliable. We know that our wastewater is being treated better. Even our stormwater is better now when it gets to rivers and streams. One of my arguments is if our infrastructure is crumbling, then why is our environment here in the United States cleaner than it's been in over 100 years? To focus exclusively on old infrastructure and on crises or near crises events is not the best way to apply limited dollars.
It is those limited dollars, more than anything else, that the infrastructure debate rests on. Whether the experts believe that American infrastructure is crumbling to pieces across the board, or they think it's in better shape than many would have you believe, they do agree that there is still work to be done. So the big question is, who should pay for it?
People have generally positive feelings about the idea of investing in infrastructure, but they don't really think further about who should actually be doing the investing and who should be paying for it. Economists have no disagreement usually on the idea that good infrastructure spending can actually bring a lot of economic growth to an economy. But where things get muddy is depending on where the money is spent.
We are under-investing in our infrastructure by almost half, so we would need to increase our investment by $2 trillion between now and 2025. But if we fail to make that investment, it will cost our GDP $3.9 trillion, so almost double. That's the cost impact on a national scale. The challenge on funding relies with everyone. It's state, it's local, it's federal, and it's also private investment. The solution will come from all four of those groups coming together to increase our investment.
State and federal monies help to build our systems across the nation. There are opportunities to incentivize locals by offering them some sort of support. It doesn't have to be large percentages, but some sort of support at the federal level, some sort of support at the state level if the local community comes up with the bulk of the money. Help them get over the hurdle of finishing that project.
You know, the greatest need, it should be really left up to state and local governments because they know where their needs are. One of the problems today is that much of this debate takes place in Washington. People think that Washington can solve all of these problems. But really, Washington's so distracted these days, it's running big deficits, it can't really be the solution to our infrastructure problem.
I think that when you look at the type of infrastructure, the cost of the project, what the scope of the work is, there's a role for the federal government and state and local.
Well, I think we should privatize as much as we can of infrastructure. And then the federal government should lift as much as possible the regulatory barriers toward a private and public partnership at the state and local level.
Public-private partnerships, or P3s for short, are long-term contracts between private companies and governments. For example, a private company would provide a portion of the financing to build or expand a highway. They would then manage the highway lanes when the project is complete. This type of partnership is often debated in cities across the country.
The advantage of this is that, governments are strapped often for money. They don't want to raise taxes. So the private sector can provide the financing, and then you get the better cost control and better management of the private sector.
For so many investment, there's just really rarely a good reason why the financing, the decision cannot be made by the private sector. There's no reason why the financing should always be done with the help of the federal government. And as much as possible, it should be driven by people who are using the money or people who are going to be footing that bill, which is why the lower the level of government, when the decision and the financing is met, the better projects you will get.
I think the time has come for private investment in infrastructure. There is corporate benefit from infrastructure, and obviously they're paying a user fee of sorts to use our systems. But when they're failing in inhibiting the economic benefits of those businesses, obviously those businesses need to consider the potential impacts of a private investment that encourages a public investment at the same time. Those types of partnerships have to be developed. We have to work towards more of that type of thinking.
Not everyone is on board with P3s. There are a few who claim that certain partnerships can be dangerous. For instance, consider the Elizabeth River Tunnels project in southeastern Virginia.
One of the most prominent solutions involved expanding two tunnels that go between Norfolk and Portsmouth, the downtown tunnel, the midtown tunnel, and they're critical pieces of infrastructure that 50 to 100,000 people, depending on the day, drive through. The deal, the public-private partnership the state did with the Elizabeth River company, this isn't my opinion, this is experts' opinion, it was one of the worst public-private partnership deals ever done. It is financially unattractive to the state. It imposes large costs on regional drivers. It lasts about 60 years, and it has inflation accelerators built into it that will increase the tolls that people are paying at least 5.5% or higher if the CPI increases higher. So it's something that is going to get worse and worse over time.
James Koch claims that the tolls unfairly disadvantage one of the poorest cities in the region, one that they were supposed to help.
The best measure of who's affected by this relates to how many people from that city go back and forth through the tunnels. Now, if you look at the region as a whole, almost 65% of people in the region every day commute to a different jurisdiction to go to work. So we're really talking about going across city lines. Well, the city of Portsmouth in particular is a lower income community where almost 20% of the population is below the poverty line. The per capita income there is only $24,000 a year. Well, unfortunately for Portsmouth, they have the largest percentage of their workforce going back and forth through the tunnel. So we're talking about a city that's probably least able to afford it, having to pay more often the greatest share of the tolls. Well, if a typical commuter goes back and forth during prime times, they'll end up paying a little bit more than $1,000 a year in tolls if they work 200 days a year. $1,000 for somebody earning $24,000, that's a big hit. That's the problem that the city of Portsmouth is facing. The burden on them is much greater than it is on the other cities in the region.
Regardless of one terrible situation, P3s are becoming more and more commonplace, and for good reason.
Yes, there are bad actors sometimes in the private sector, but at the very least, they can be held accountable. And at the state and federal level, they really never are. On average, the rule of thumb based on the data is that the return on private sector investment is just way higher.
Many Americans may wonder about what their role is in all of this. If they can't personally invest, is there anything they can do to take care of their community's infrastructure?
First, get educated about the state of the infrastructure, and at a minimum, become aware of the issue and vote. Because so often, whether or not infrastructure investment happens comes down to how we act as an individual and whether or not we vote.
People have a vote, and votes are very powerful. Where are the votes most powerful? At your local level. Where is a lot of infrastructure controlled? At the local level. Most infrastructure in the United States has some public agency attached to it. There's water control boards, sewer and sanitation districts, there's transportation districts, electrical provision districts. In other words, there are government committees and entities at the local, state, and federal level that regulate these businesses and providers. And yet Americans don't interact with these levels of government at all. If you go to your local sewer and sanitation district meeting, first of all, I suspect the members of the board are going to be very surprised that actually somebody showed up. And they'll listen, because their job is to work as a government to provide the oversight, the rules and the regulations within which the providers operate. If you're dissatisfied, run for an office. Most Americans look at office and go, oh, that's too hard, it's too complicated, it's too political. We're not talking about running for national office, but we're talking about, hey, try to get appointed to your local development board, try to get appointed to your local tourism board. Those are the key elements of government where citizens can impact policy which affects outcomes.
In the end, the situation is quite complex. Infrastructure is a game of numbers and figures, but also one of lives. It is something that affects each and every American, and so each should strive to further educate themselves about it. Go to your city officials. Speak to those who control the infrastructure in your town or your city, and keep in mind these final words as you do.
We have gone back and forth in the United States on this issue. There is no right answer. There is no moral answer, in that economically we say the society has to decide what's the role of government at the national, state, and local government level. The more you say the role of the government should be, you have to realize the more freedoms you're going to give up, because the government's going to dictate more of how you live your life.